Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland should be focused on Monday's fall economic statement and the tariff threats coming from U.S. President-elect Donald Trump. Instead, she is facing some difficult questions about her tenure as Finance Minister after more reporting from the Globe and Mail about the Prime Minister courting Mark Carney to join his cabinet.
How can you stay in the government when the Prime Minister continually tries to cut you off at the knees like that? And will you fight back against this effort to replace you?
Well, thank you for the question. For me, it is a huge privilege that I do not take for granted to serve Canada and Canadians every single day. I really don't spend a lot of time focusing on Ottawa gossip. My focus is on doing what I can to serve Canada and Canadians in what's a really challenging time for our country.
These semi-regular leaks about tensions between the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister's office continue to raise questions about a government already on the ropes and under pressure to pull together a solid Team Canada to deal with the trade threats from the United States. We're going to talk about all of that with our party insiders. Greg McEachern is a former Liberal ministerial staffer. Fred Delory is a former Conservative campaign manager. We separated them this week because Melanie Richer is back in the studio. She is a former communications director for the NDP. Happy Friday, guys. Good to have you all back at the big table. Greg, let's start with you. I don't know who is leaking these stories to the Globe and Mail, but if they're a Liberal, I don't know if they're helping the Liberals. What did you make of what Chrystia Freeland is seemingly dealing with today?
So I would agree with you. These leaks are not helpful. And I would say, you know, the stories all seem to be in the same newspaper, the Globe and Mail. There's been 3 recently. I've said on Twitter as well. There was one that I thought was particularly unhelpful where the person decided to reveal that they didn't know whether or not the Trump dinner at Mar-a-Lago was a go or not. I don't understand how you could be on the Prime Minister's team and think that that was a helpful bit of information, unless you're trying to curry favor with the journalist. I have no idea. I became a communications director a long time ago, last century, 1999. I learned a lot from folks at the Canadian Press about sourced items and their rules around, you know, 3 people needed to confirm this. So if the Prime Minister's office feels that the reporting is inaccurate or wrong, they need to take that up. They need to follow that up. You know, I have no information on that. I do, you know, when I see a source, an anonymously sourced article like that, I do find it troubling. I mean, there has to be some smoke to the fire.
They mentioned 10 sources, right?
You know, that's a lot of sources. Are those sources in PMO? No one knows. If they are, there is a precedent. A leak like this happened around Bill Morneau a couple of years ago. And I think perhaps somebody got out over their skis, started talking about that, and they might have been talking about more about, you know, the next 4 months. And instead it became an instant story. And as a result, I think what had been planned for a bigger shuffle had to be, you know, hurried along. So sometimes they're really not helpful. I do know this, that the Prime Minister is a big fan of Minister Freeland and vice versa. I know his Chief of Staff is a big fan of Minister Freeland. She's worked very hard. If you have a problem with someone in your cabinet, you should be talking to that person face to face. I do think Minister Freeland has some improvement she could do on how she communicates, because this is evident when she talked about canceling your Disney Plus subscription. We know through Freedom of Information requests, a lot of Canadians felt very strongly about that and wrote. But that's not the way to handle it.
Look, and for the record, I've had multiple people in the Prime Minister's office say the same thing to me about Mar-a-Lago, that in justifying the need for all the secrecy, because normally the Prime Minister's office tells us when he's going somewhere, and he left the country on a foreign trip and did not tell us because, you know, it was a request of the Trump crowd, and they didn't want to announce it and have it fall apart by announcing it. So just to put that out there. You know, Fred, the information we kind of have is that the Prime Minister's office, or the Prime Minister in some capacity, has talked to Carney about a role multiple times, this time not necessarily as finance minister, which is what the conclusion is, but like some sort of Canada-US related role because of the current situation. But what are your thoughts on all of this coming out into the ecosystem?
Well, it's interesting watching. It seems to be two different teams leaking two different sets of messages. We have what appears to be Team Freeland leaking some stuff out, and then Team Trudeau or PMO leaking it out. And with 10 sources, the Globe and Mail mentioned 10 sources. That's an incredible number of people leaking about dysfunction or issues between the Prime Minister of Canada and his Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance at a time when the Liberals are already 20 points back in the polls, 9 years into a government, facing one of the most consequential threats in Canadian history in terms of a major tariff and trade war going on. We're going to talk maybe later about the Premiers and First Ministers meeting and Team Canada. Like, Trudeau doesn't seem to be able to manage his own team. I don't know how he's going to manage Team Canada, and it's just more chaos that is happening. And I always make for years now I've been talking about how they need a narrative, they have a message. I'm actually seeing it come together now. Dysfunction and desperation is the Liberal narrative. That's where they are.
Would you recommend they put that on the plane or put that on the bus? Probably you would, but I don't think anyone else would.
By mistake, how this is all going.
Mel, what do you think of this? I mean, 10 sources is a lot of sources. There's always tensions between a finance minister and a PMO in most governments, but this stuff keeps spilling out. What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, it keeps spilling out, and it seems to be a continuation of exactly that story of folks aren't happy. We had the letter from however many MPs asking the Prime Minister to resign. It just continues to seem like there's, to your point, chaos internally, and the Prime Minister's unable or trying to get ahead of it with some of these leaks or not. It seems a little bit unclear. But we saw this story, I want to say a month or two ago now, about how maybe Minister Freeland was going to be shuffled out. So it feels like if that's going to happen, you kind of got to do it already, because these rumors coming and going and not really do anything, all it does is it shows Canadians that you don't have control on what it is that you're doing and you don't have a cohesive message. To your point, Minister Freeland is quite, she's accomplished, has done some good things, but has been really, has had a big challenge in communicating with people in a way that people feel like, you understand what I'm going through. You understand my hardships. You seem a little bit disconnected from what I'm going through. So I do understand from that capacity, particularly as we see the Canada-US stuff. But it only works if the Prime Minister is being able to communicate clearly, and that hasn't worked either. So you can't just put all the blame at Minister Freeland's feet. You gotta take some ownership on that too.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you. Freeland, people point at her because she is the economic minister, right? But it's bigger than her as finance minister. It's unfair to put it all at Chrystia Freeland, right?
Totally unfair to put it all at her feet. The Prime Minister is the one that is leading the team and should be able to communicate to people why he's running again and what it is his government's going to do. I think the maybe unhelpful thing is Minister Freeland is also seems a little bit incapable of meeting people where they're at. So the two sides of that is not helpful, and probably some of what we're seeing play out in these rumored conversations.
So Greg, we've been hearing about a possible cabinet shuffle since the summer, right? It was going to happen around Thanksgiving, then it was going to happen around Remembrance Day, and then it was going to happen in early December, and now it may still happen before Christmas, but more likely in January, because you got to be ready for the inauguration on January 20th. So that's been out there in the zeitgeist for a while. But do you really think there are 10 people who know what the Prime Minister is contemplating when it comes to a cabinet shuffle? Because the way that PMO operates, it seems to me like that number might be small. There might be 10 people who think they know, but people who really know, it seems like it'd be a smaller number. So
I referred earlier to my first time as a director of communications. It was in provincial politics, was opposition, and again the Canadian press style. I really encouraged people who worked with me to write in that style and to follow their guidelines. And again, if the Canadian press, if 3 sources are good, why 10? It kind of seemed like, this is just my opinion, it kind of seemed like
because people smack it down, right? So 3 is the bar, 10 is the ammunition, right?
Yeah, it's the third story in a row like this, and yet no one will go on the record. In terms of the cabinet shuffle, I've heard for a while that some consideration around Minister Freeland having both Deputy Prime Minister and finance minister was a lot, because that deputy prime minister role, especially in terms of her relationship with Ukraine, was very, very important and kind of symbolic and perhaps even a little ceremonial, but it's a lot. I did an interview with an online publication this week, and they were asking me, why do they need a cabinet shovel? And I reminded them that there are 2 cabinet ministers that are carrying
double duty
portfolios. Yeah. I ran into Anita Anand the other night, and she said, she learned very quickly that Transport Canada, exists in pretty much every constituency. So you have those 2 individuals, and you also have Minister Freeland carrying those 2 roles. So at some point, I don't. I can't conceive, especially in the case of Anita Anand. I worked at Treasury Board. I worked at DFO with Coast Guard. I know Transport Canada. Those are 2 massive departments. People outside of Ottawa might not realize how important Treasury Board is, but really nothing gets spent without the president of the Treasury Board taking a look at it, and it's an important check and balance that we have in our system. But that's like those 2 portfolios.
No, those are 2 big jobs, right? And no one person should be wearing those. And Fred, this is kind of the challenge, right? That there's a lot of big duties spread on a small number of people, and here now the political viability of the finance minister and deputy prime minister keeps getting challenged. And I just, if you were advising a prime minister in a situation like this, what would you tell them to do? Like, they just come out and say, she's my finance minister until the election, or what do they do there?
Be firm with it if that's the case. If the prime minister truly believes that Chrystia Freeland's the person, tell us that, because right now we're getting all these stories, we're getting bombarded, and it's been for a long time. We keep talking about Carney, and I don't see that coming out from the prime minister saying that's my person. Like, and doesn't need to use those words, but just very clearly, like, this is who we're going with. We have faith in her abilities to do this.
Doesn't the fact that she hasn't been moved tell us that? You know what I mean? Like, you're in cabinet,
because
it matters, right?
As Greg says, like this, you've got a number of cabinet ministers with double duty. You have a whack of cabinet ministers that said they're not even running again in the next election. We are going into an election year. So to me, it just looks like more incompetence and dysfunction than an actual, commitment to her if they haven't done anything.
Right. So she is the chief economic minister. She's the finance minister, and she also chairs the Canada-U.S. Relations Committee, Mel. And I think that's going to get busy. Even busier than it is, right?
Absolutely.
So one of the issues they've had is getting premiers on board. They seem to have come out of the First Minister's meeting, at least on their border plan. We'll talk about the other stuff in a second. At least on the border plan, having Doug Ford and Danielle Smith saying, I think they've got something there. A 5-point plan we'll see in the fall economic statement. So she broke news on what the feds are going to do. How important was that, do you think, that they seem to have something that even their biggest critics domestically are okay with it right now?
Yeah, absolutely. That'll be key for the Prime Minister and, frankly, for Canada as it relates to potential tariffs coming from the United States. So that's good news. We're going to talk to the U.S. before we talk to Canadians about what this looks like, is a little bit less reassuring. Like, I appreciate the gamesmanship there, or the importance of you're dealing with somebody who is unpredictable.
They've got a constituency of 1 right now, right? Is the challenge, though, isn't it? They've got to make him happy.
Yeah, totally. The problem is folks aren't necessarily hearing anything from this government. They're hearing a lot from Premier Ford, they're hearing a lot from their premiers, but they're not necessarily seeing a plan or hearing from the government reassure, other than we're working on stuff behind the scenes. And unfortunately for this government, that's kind of been their message on everything for the last few years, and folks haven't seen it. So when you've already lost regular folks on most other things, it's really hard to point to, well, we've got a plan and the plan is coming. That trust has already been broken, so it's really hard to take it back. Good news that the premiers seem happy. I think everybody's kind of looking forward to what that plan looks like. But yeah, I guess we'll just have to wait and see.
If that plan heads off the tariffs, though,
totally.
People will pay attention to that, right? So there is that. So look, while they work on this carrot to offer Donald Trump, there's a lot of talk about a stick too, because Ontario, Premier Doug Ford, he's talking about cutting off the power, and he may have a partner in that. Just have a listen to this.
British Columbia provides peak power support all the way down the west coast of the United States to Washington State, Oregon, and California. We sold $1 billion worth of electricity to those states last year. When I say nothing's off the table for British Columbia, nothing is off the table. I mean it. We will not stop until we are assured that the Americans fully understand how intertied we are.
Every congressperson I speak to, or governor or senator, I'm not hearing the same thing as what I'm hearing from the president. So I'm hearing, let's get moving, let's make a deal and get this done. And we'll get through it. So there may be a few bumps in the road. We just have to be prepared.
Now, obviously, Scott Moe and Danielle Smith have different views on that, but I just want to play one more clip if I can, because Chrystia Freeland, who we started talking about, she was asked about potential retaliation on a federal level, and just have a listen to what she had to say.
It's really important to hope for the best and to prepare for the worst. And the Prime Minister has been clear that in the event that the United States were to impose unjustified tariffs on Canada, of course we would respond. And the Canadian response would necessarily be robust. I am confident that it would be effective.
Okay, so Greg, we have Doug Ford very loudly saying, we'll turn off the lights, we won't buy your liquor, we won't put it in our stores. Stephen Lecce is going to be on the show a little bit later. David Eby saying nothing's off the table. But Scott Moe says some of the ideas the feds are talking about, like export taxes on things that get carved out to inflict pain on the Americans, are a betrayal of the Team Canada approach. Where do you think this goes domestically?
It's interesting that the Conservative blue wall has some cracks in it on this stuff. I think it's interesting, though, that we're not really comparing apples to apples in some of the threats that the premiers make. I mean, it's one thing to talk about energy. It's another thing to talk about resources and oil. They're very different things. And it's also really, the connections in terms of, pipelines or how the electricity is distributed. There's a lot of back and forth in terms of cross-border. And it'd be really easy for the Americans to retaliate and say, well, where does your oil go through, or how does this work? So it's not as cut and dried as that. I'm less and less a fan of Doug Ford these days, things like the Greenbelt, the humongous cabinet he has, spending. But I will say this, his tone is very similar, the way he approaches politics, very similar to the way that Donald Trump talks and the way that the people that Donald Trump likes to listen to speak. So he could be a really effective part of this because of his very blunt, down-to-earth style.
You'll feel better about Doug Ford when you get your $200 check, Greg. I'm sure you will. Fred, what do you make of these differing views on the Team Canada approach and how to respond? Because Trump's talking about a tariff on everything, and Doug Ford is willing to do some extreme things, but others are saying, wait a minute, don't do this, don't do that, don't touch this. Like, does this erode the United Front, or what do you think?
Well, there is no united front. We have different premiers saying different things. And I think it's a lack of leadership on the top that is leading to that. Not that it's going to be easy to deal with all the premiers, but there's, we had Ford come out and say this, and we had Eby come out and say this. Then Freeland came out. The federal, the deputy prime minister then said, yeah, we'll do this too. She's following along with what the premiers are saying. There's no, there is no Team Canada approach right now.
But can the feds go as hard as the premiers? I mean, look, the premiers are.
Well, she said the same thing they said.
Right, but well, she's not saying what Doug Ford is saying. It's like we're going to cut off power to
no, but that'll be retaliatory. That'll be retaliatory.
Right, but like rhetorically and aggressively, when you are responsible for foreign affairs and you've got to be the person who will actually sit down at the table with Trump on this sort of stuff, can you go as hard as Doug Ford is doing, or do you just let him do that kind of bad cop approach for you?
If that's the plan, if that's the approach they're doing, but that doesn't seem to be what the case is. Absolutely, if you can work together and have a different a plan on that, or you have a good cop, bad cop, for sure you can do that. That doesn't seem to be the case. There's not a lot of trust between the premiers and the prime minister.
I'm not sure I agree with that.
You think it's a plan?
I think initially there was when Doug Ford said what he said about Mexico, and I think Danielle Smith said similar things.
You think that's part of the Liberal plan, and they had them do it?
No, I don't. If you could just let me finish the sentence. I don't think that was by design. But I think since then there have been conversations because of that, and that there is some connection perhaps between Freeland and Ford on this. And in terms of leadership that you're talking about, do you really expect that Danielle Smith is going to follow what Justin Trudeau instructs her to do? No, that's not going to happen.
Not instruct. Just work as a team.
And let's just keep in mind here, like if this was somebody who had not been president before, we would not be having these deep discussions and deep reactions. There'd be a transition plan being worked on by this. I mean, he is getting a lot of accord because he used to be in office, but we're all still jumping to a post on his social media about 25%. And when he did an interview with the Associated Press the other day, he said off camera, it sounded like he listened to what Doug Ford said, well, there may be some room to move.
CNBC. I think it got picked up by the AP, but it was the CNBC. Yeah, no, it's all good. I just want to give credit to the media organizations while we're all still around. Mel, what are your thoughts on, like, there are differing views. Everyone says, let's find a way through this, but it's the path that they feel they need to take. What are your thoughts?
Again, I'll go back to you're dealing with somebody who's unpredictable, but the man's not even in office yet.
I know.
There's
Can you
going to
imagine?
This is just the first thing, right?
Yep.
So this will set the stage for how the next things go. And I think I gave full credit to the Prime Minister for going to Mar-a-Lago. I was surprised by that. I thought that could be smart. But the just giving in and saying yes to everything that Donald Trump says, I don't think will be helpful. And if that was the approach of, we're working behind the scenes because we're getting him to a good place, then explain to me the speech this week where the Prime Minister kind of took a dig at the fact that Kamala Harris lost. I think giving them a little bit too much credit on, they're organized and they know what they're doing behind the scenes because, that room of folks was a lot of women. That was probably something that I wanted to hear, but not helpful if you had to, run down to Mar-a-Lago to have conversations about please don't, impose a 25% tariff on us. So I think the patchwork, Minister Freeland got there eventually, retaliations are on the table, but let's be super hopeful. And we're, I just don't think it's going to work with this president. So I'll disagree with you. There's a lot of stuff that I don't like that Premier Ford does, but that, I don't mind hearing that.
Right.
I don't mind seeing
But we did retaliate last time. Right, I remember famously.
They were surgically applied to us and surgically applied back. This
Kentucky
is
bourbon,
different, right?
When the U.S. ambassador that was here at the time was from Kentucky, Mitch McConnell.
Yeah.
There were retaliatory tactics before. It's not that we haven't ever done them before.
Yeah. So, but and I appreciate that they have this calibrated response, right? They have to have, right? That of being seen to be taking it seriously, but not to be panicking, to do things that will satisfy the president-elect's demands without looking like you're completely capitulating to what he wants. But if you come up with $1 billion border package that staves off 25% tariffs, that's the best return on investment this government has ever had, right?
For sure, if they can do that, and if we get to that point. One of the big concerns, like we're talking about the tariffs, there's a big trade negotiation coming up. Not just it's coming up before then, it's coming up immediately. When Trump comes in, he's going to be pushing this right away. This is not
fair.
Waiting. It's going to start. And what concerns me is we have an election in the middle of this. We're going to be in a very poor negotiating stance until that election happens, whether Trudeau gets another mandate or the Conservatives or the NDP or the Green Party if they form government somehow. Until that happens, we're in a lame duck situation ourselves where it's going to be very
hard. Were you at a
hard.
Christmas party before you came here? I'm just kidding. I like this. I like this scenario. Sorry. Continue.
I'm not saying any of that's logical other than a conservative. I'm just trying to be polite. In the next 10 months, we're having an election. We're going to be down the road and having very heated negotiations that are going to get tossed out and started over, very likely. I don't think that's helpful. I think that's why we truly need an election. And last week, you mentioned Andrew Coyne's column. I'll mention his column this week, too, where he agreed with me that we need an election now. It's getting to the point where we're walking down a dangerous path.
Okay, so look, we're probably not going to get an election right now, unless something's happening at Rita Hall that I don't know about. But, we are going to get a fall economic statement on Monday, Fred's favorite topic, the Fez.
Maybe that'll trigger.
But, but it could play into it. So, like, Mel, I mean, the liberal hope all along had been maybe if Trump gets elected, that might be an externality that will change people's views, politically. If interest rates start coming down, maybe that'll change people's views. I don't know if that's happened, and we may see a larger than anticipated deficit on Monday, and we've already got unemployment that's going up to 7%. I mean, if they're looking for a bounce from the Feds, as we call it in this town on Monday, it might be more of an anchor than it is a fiscal anchor.
Yeah, I don't see how it could help at this point. I think we saw the big package with the GST and how expensive that'll be too. So where you try to find a path to, reassure folks is going to be really hard. It's also really difficult to anticipate if those tariffs do come in, like what those numbers actually look like. So it'll be interesting to see what is in the FES and how it's taken because of that. But I would also say, like, the approach of the Liberals to just kind of wait and see to external circumstances to improve our favor with Canadians hasn't worked so far. I can't imagine that it'll work on Monday. And without, a plan, a reason, here's how I'm making your life better, I just don't see how we're talking about anything other than here's another thing that is harming the Liberals instead of helping.
Well, yeah, Greg, that's what I wonder. Could Monday make things worse, right? If the deficit and sorry, man, I'm not trying to hurt you. I know we're close.
It's Christmas.
Look, it's just the news, but like it seems like.
Of course it could, David.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
of course it could.
You take it from there.
Yeah. I find sometimes this government is the king of unintended consequences for a lot of things. I mean, what I think they'll try to telegraph, especially to make Fred happy, is focus a narrative. And it's going to be things like affordability. So you're going to hear like about the GST, but also interest rates coming down, job creation and growth. We know that we can see polling where Canadians are now more focused on that than ever. And that's also going to be an issue, I think, in dealing with the incoming president. And then sleeping next door to the elephant. The third part I'd be watching for is on borders. Yeah. But what will everybody be focused on is the guardrails, debt to GDP, deficit to GDP, and have they hit them?
Yeah, the border plan will help detract from that. But Fred, I give you the last word because I know the FES is your favorite thing, going back to last year, saying, it would drive the narrative, right?
Yeah, and I completely forgot what last year's FES was all about because it was not memorable.
It was about the guardrails we're all going to look at this year, yeah.
So it may be, this year's may be memorable, and I think it could be it's the deficit, that's going to be, this giant black hole of Liberal spending where money just disappears. When Trudeau ran, we mocked him in 2015 because he's going to have $10 billion a year deficit. Now it's 40, and now we're hearing it could be as high as 60 this year. It's just, that is what I think is going to come out of this if it's that high as what's memorable. I have a hard time believing they'll have an actual strong narrative, but look forward to seeing what they come up with.